Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Welcome to Nada Yada Island.
Next on Metro's Nada Yada Island podcast.
I almost fainted when the 4 new bomb shelves arrived. 4 free Samsung Galaxy A16 5G phones at Metro.
No way.
And finding out the 4th line is free. Oh, things got heated.
That's wild. Join Metro and get 4 free Samsung 5G phones. Only at Metro.
Plus tax. Bring 4 numbers and an ID and sign up for any Metro Flex plan. Not available currently at T-Mobile or have been with Metro in the past 180 days.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Achtung, Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, your Second World War podcast for all your Second World War podcast needs, whatever they could be. And Jim, we're joined today by a very, very special guest, someone who I think it's fair to say both of our bookshelves have done a fair bit of groaning thereof, his work. Certainly, in fact, I recently read an article of his about olive drab, which I found incredibly useful because I'm modelling some Shermans at the moment. And what this guy doesn't know about olive drab, it ain't worth knowing, I think it's fair to say. So who are we joined by today, Jim?
It's Steve Zaloga, and I've got to say, I'm absolutely thrilled that you've joined us, Steve. I'm a massive fan. Yes, and Al's absolutely right. I've got a ton of your books. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you are the guru when it comes to World War II armour. You know, you can talk to the chieftain, and obviously over here we've got the brilliant David Willey, but when it comes to American hardware particularly, wow, you're the man. So welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for coming on.
Well, nice to talk to you guys.
And Steve, I mean, we were just rabbiting away just before we came on, but I mean, you know, where to begin? I mean, for my money, the Sherman tank's the kind of number one tank of the war. I seem to remember you once said that it was the Panzer III. Let's start with that for an opening gambit.
I don't remember ever saying Panzer III, but if I had to pick maybe the top 3 tanks of the war, it would certainly be the Sherman, the T-34, and the Panzer IV.
Oh, Panzer IV. Okay.
Let me give a reason for that. I did a book a number of years ago called Armored Champion, The Best Tanks of World War II. And what I argued there is that you have to actually come up with 2 categories. One category is the top tank for commanders. And by that, I mean, what's the war-winning tank? What is the one that the big commanders want to have because it allows them to dominate the battlefield? So you need, you know, the features that categorize great tanks. You know, it's got to have armor and firepower and mobility, but it also has to have reliability and it has to have quantity. You have to have a lot of them. So a highly specialized tank like, say, the Tiger I or the M26 Pershing, it's not going to be in that category. But the other way to judge tanks would be what I call the top tanker pick. And by that, I mean, you know, if you're a tanker and you're sitting in a tank, what do you want? Well, you probably don't want a Sherman. You really don't want a T-34. You want something with thicker armor with a bigger gun. So, you know, you want a Tiger II, you want an IS-2, you want something like that. It's kind of the criteria if you're playing something like World of Tanks or, you know, a video game. You're going to want a very, very powerful tank. But a tank commander, an Eisenhower or Patton, is not necessarily going to choose those kind of tanks because oftentimes they're few in number because they're so expensive. Their durability sometimes isn't that great. So getting back to it, I would say Sherman T-34, Panzer IV for the commander's pick rather than the tanker's pick.
It's always about pluses and minuses, isn't it? Because, you know, you go for your bigger gun and you go for the thicker armor, but that then means it's heavier, which then means it's kind of less easy to operate because it's more complicated, because the roads can't stand it. It means, you know, if you're on the attack, that's problematic because you've then got to have a bridge that is capable of taking that extra weight, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always kind of sort of swings and roundabouts, isn't it? And, you know, you put a Pershing on, well, that obviously takes up more space than a Sherman in a Liberty ship, for example. So
before we go any further, and this is a staple of the internet, we three here are talking about tanks like we all agree what that might be. Steve, what is a tank? We have to define the tank because, after all, we've just been looking at the Ardennes offensive, and, you know, TD's come into that battle quite comprehensively, particularly on the, you know, the American side.
TD being tank destroyer.
It's built into their doctrine. It's part of their anti-tank doctrine and part of their sort of counterattack doctrine. What is a tank? Put us out of our misery, Steve.
It does get hard to define because tanks also spawn all sorts of variants. So the Sherman tank also spawned self-propelled howitzers, you know, like the M7. It spawned assault guns like the M4 105mm, which looks like a tank, but was classified by the Army as an assault gun because it's intended for indirect fire. Well, I'd say, okay, first the weapon. It's a direct fire weapon. So that rules out self-propelled artillery. Its main weapon is designed for direct fire, you know, line of sight fire. Armor, it has to be fully protected because a tank is a multi-purpose platform. It's got to be able to fight in urban environments and in close terrain. So it rules out a lot of tank destroyers, which have very light armor and have an open top because they really don't need it. That's not their role. And mobility, you know, okay, tanks are very similar to other vehicles. I don't think there's anything mobility-wise that separates tanks from self-propelled artillery or tank destroyers or vehicles of that sort. So I would say probably the big criteria is the firepower, direct fire weapon, the armor protection. And let me throw in another one, which just occurred to me. It has to have a turret as far as I'm concerned, you know, because once again, if it gets involved in urban fighting or close terrain, you want a turret to be able to traverse the gun simply, as opposed to weapons like the Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun, the German assault gun, weapons like that, the Soviet Su-85 or Su-100, which have a fixed casemate. So I would use that as another criteria. It should have a turret.
Fantastic. Thank you. No, seriously, there we are. We've done it. We've landed it.
Yes, but recently, Joey, who you saw just a minute ago, our producer, got us a tank to drive through the centre of London as a kind of PR stunt. And we kept saying to people, well, it is a tank, but it's not a tank because it's an M10. But that's got a turret, that's got a big gun, but it hasn't got much armour.
If you think that that's bad, you probably don't follow U.S. armor development in the current period, but the U.S. Army's latest armored fighting vehicle is a thing called the M10 Booker. And if you pop up a picture of it, you look at it, you will say it is a tank. It certainly looks like a tank. The problem is the Army does not define it as a tank. They absolutely insist that it's not a tank. It's something that they call a mobile protected firepower. So we're not the only ones who have some difficulty defining this thing.
Well, listen, while we've mentioned tank destroyers, I mean, tank destroyer regiments and battalions and stuff, they are unique to the US. I mean, can we just talk a little bit about that and explain to people what they are and the concept behind it and all the rest of it?
They started out alongside the first U.S. Army armored divisions in 1940-41, because before 1940-41, tanks, in quotes, were literally part of the infantry branch. The cavalry also had tanks, but they weren't called tanks. They were called combat cars. So in 1940-41, the U.S. Army amalgamates both infantry and cavalry into this new branch, armored force. They create the armored divisions, the separate tank battalions. At the same time, after seeing what happens in France in 1940, the Army says, well, we also have to deal with the threat of the blitzkrieg of German panzer divisions. And the U.S. Armored Division is actually not designed to fight panzer divisions. That's not part of its doctrine. Its doctrine is basically offensive. It's designed to do the exploitation mission after the infantry has won the breakthrough. So it's very much a cavalry-style mission because the early armor force commanders are mostly cavalry officers. So the rest of the Army says, okay, well, we still have this problem of dealing with the panzers. So they set up a separate branch from the armor branch called Tank Destroyer Command. And at first, there's a great debate as to what the tank destroyer is going to be. The head of Army Ground Forces, Leslie McNair, he says he's an artillery guy. He wants towed anti-tank guns. He thinks that's very, very cost effective. So you just use towed anti-tank guns. That deals with the Panzer threat.
Yeah, and that's what they've got in Tunisia, isn't it?
Exactly. And also they do army maneuvers in the summer of 1940-41 using towed anti-tank guns. The 37mm anti-tank gun, which is the infantry's anti-tank gun, and they took some old World War I French 75s, modernized them, and they were using those as anti-tank guns. They find that they're just not very effective because guess what happens? Your division has whatever number, let's just say 30, and they stretch them out along the divisional front. So at any point on the divisional front, you only have a handful of anti-tank guns. And so, the Panzers can mass and overwhelm a handful of anti-tank guns. So they come up with this idea that the key is mobility. They have to have an anti-tank gun that is very, very mobile, that once the Panzers appear and break through, you can mass the anti-tank guns, rush them up to the front, and then counter the Panzer breakthrough. So that's where the idea emerges of a tank destroyer that's a vehicle. And the emphasis there is speed and not armor. So when you see the early tank destroyers, some of them have no armor at all. The M6 37mm is literally just a truck with a 37 on it. The first of the 75s is just a half track with very thin armor and a 75. And then the custom-built ones start to appear. The M10 with a 3-inch gun and the M18 with a 76mm gun. Then later the M36. But there's controversy all through the war about it. The tank destroyers don't perform very well in Tunisia. Most of the senior commanders say we don't want tank destroyers. Tanks can do the job. So that becomes a big doctrinal controversy all through the war. Tank destroyers really don't do that well. They do well locally. I mean, there's certainly some instances where tank destroyer battalions do extremely well. But as a part of the bigger picture of the U.S. Army, they're generally viewed as having been unsuccessful, and they disappear after the war. They hold a general board to inspect lessons of the war. The general board says, no, tank destroyers are a failed concept. We're going to use tanks to do both missions, both the cavalry exploitation mission as well as the tank defense mission.
Because at the end of the Bulge, Ike says these need to all be self-propelled. Tank destroyer formations need to all be self-propelled. The towed gun crews, they can't keep up. They're not well enough protected. They can't extract themselves from danger as easily as the self-propelled guns. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and the strange thing about the fighting in the Bulges is that those towed battalions were actually a 1943 innovation. Those towed battalions didn't go back to the start of the Tank Destroyer Command. They actually appeared in 1943 after Tunisia, because Army Ground Forces under McNair looks at the lesson of Tunisia and says, well, look at what the British did with their 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Towed anti-tank guns are the solution. And so they actually go back and convert a number of self-propelled tank destroyer battalions into towed battalions, and they equip them with the towed 3-inch anti-tank gun. So there's two problems. Number one, the towed concept proves to be not very good. And then secondly, the 3-inch towed anti-tank gun is horrible. It's basically the carriage for the 105mm howitzer with a very, very large, very, very heavy 3-inch gun plopped on top of it. It's not really an ideal anti-tank gun. It's not comparable, for example, to the German 75mm PaK 40, which is a much more compact, much more powerful weapon. So they've got the worst of both worlds.
It's an anti-aircraft gun repurposed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually a dual-purpose gun. The original 3-inch was both a naval gun, like a deck gun, and an anti-aircraft gun. It was not designed as a dedicated anti-tank gun. It was just a repurposed naval gun or anti-aircraft gun. And as I say, it was put on a fairly heavy carriage. It was put on the 105mm howitzer carriage. And as a result, it just wasn't very successful. It was too heavy to move around very easily. It had to be moved by a prime mover. And the whole concept of towed guns was a failure. They were a failure in Normandy. They had the towed battalions in Normandy, mostly attached to infantry divisions. They were widely hated because you can imagine having weapons like that in the Bocage country, behind the hedgerows and stuff. And they weren't flexible enough to be used in that environment. And then in the autumn of 1944, it just didn't matter. There were no tanks around to shoot at. So finally, the towed battalions have the opportunity to prove themselves at the beginning of the Battle of Bulge when the Germans are attacking with large numbers of tanks. They're a complete failure. They get overrun. There's any number of battalions that just got overrun. They're not very flexible. And on the other hand, the Bell battalions in the Ardennes actually do quite well. There were a number of battalions that really had absolutely stellar records.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of, we've obviously been reading up on the Bulge recently, and, the amount of time M36s, Jacksons turn up with their 90mm gun and sort of create havoc with the German armour. I mean, that seems quite prevalent to me. Maybe that's just in the reading. I don't know.
Well, it was partly because the M36 was the most powerful. It had the most powerful anti-tank gun of any U.S. armored vehicle. It was basically the old M10, but with a new turret with a 90 millimeter gun. And it formed a stopgap until they got the M26 Pershings into service, which don't start to appear until February of 45. And the strange thing is the M36 was actually not a pick by the Tank Destroyer Command. It actually originated by the Armored Fighting Vehicles section at SHAEF headquarters in London. These guys were looking at the lessons and saying, we want a more powerful weapon, whether it's on a tank destroyer or a tank. They also wanted the M26 Pershing. But Army ground forces wouldn't support it. Army ground forces would not support a 90 millimeter gun. They said, we have no evidence from 1943 or from the Italian campaign that we need a more powerful gun. And so AFV section with SHAEF headquarters comes up and says, to work around this, they said, well, we don't want it for fighting tanks. We want it to fight the Siegfried line. We're going to use it as a bunker buster. And that was complete baloney. They knew all along they wanted it for tank fighting, but they couldn't get past the hurdle of the bureaucracy in Washington. So they came up with this phony thing, and AGF was forced to do it because AGF's doctrine was, if the front wants it, then we've got to do it. So they rushed these M36 into service. They started appearing in Europe in September, October, and they're an immediate success because they're so powerful, and they're the only weapon that can really deal with a German Panther tank. The 76 millimeter on the Sherman, unless you have HVAP ammunition, is not very successful. And the other tank destroyers with the 3-inch and the 76 are not successful. So the M36 is the only thing out there where you can reliably kill Panthers.
The M10 is the Sherman chassis variant, isn't it? And it's got that angled armour because it's more lightly armoured. They're trying to make the most of the surface area, aren't they, by having it in those sort of geometric shapes, right?
That's exactly it. But it's very thinly armoured. The armour on it will protect against something like a heavy machine gun, but it won't protect even against very light tank guns, 37 millimeter, that sort of thing. It was just intended to defend. The idea of those early tank destroyers was they were going to sort of sit off and fire somewhat from ambush. They weren't expected to get into a knockdown, drag-out fight with tanks at close range. So the armor was fairly modest. It was less than what was on a Sherman.
Yeah. And the crews know it, of course. That's the thing.
Well, they have no roof over their head.
I mean, that's the other thing. The open fighting compartment goes through all the tank destroyer designs. Always strikes me as a very hairy design solution. Obviously it's about getting the weight down, and it's about getting the larger breach of the gun into a turret and all those sort of things. But goodness me, it makes the survivability in that vehicle a lot lower, doesn't it? Surely.
Oh, exactly. And the problem is that the way that the tank destroyer battalions were used during World War II is that typically a battalion would be attached to an infantry division. So a U.S. infantry division in combat would typically have a tank battalion attached to it and a tank destroyer battalion. Well, the problem is that the infantry guys really didn't know how to use either the tank battalion or the tank destroyer battalion. There was no doctrine. The first field manual doesn't come out until March 44. And that really didn't address the problem. And so the infantry guys tend to use the tank destroyers the same way they use the tanks. So they go and send them right up to the front. So the guys in the tanks at least have protection over their heads. So, if you're dealing, common problems, mortars, especially in France, that's one of the most deadly weapons in close-in fighting. Whereas the poor tank destroyer crews, they're completely exposed to small arms fire, and especially to mortar fire, and of course to artillery fire.
And so our tank destroyer battalions, do they suffer proportionally much more than tank battalions?
Well, actually what ends up happening is that, and getting back to this unfortunate case of tank destroyer battalions, because there's a shortage of tank destroyer battalions, the self-propelled ones, the infantry divisions usually get stuck with the towed tank destroyer battalions. And what ends up happening is that they're so awful, especially in the first 6 weeks in Normandy where the U.S. Army is fighting in the hedgerows. The infantry divisions try using them in the hedgerows, and they're a complete failure. And so all that happens is that those tank destroyer battalions, the towed ones, are put under divisional artillery. And they're simply used to reinforce the divisional artillery. They're not used for direct fire support of the forward infantry regiments. They're just used as artillery. So that issue really doesn't come up that often. There are a handful of self-propelled tank destroyer battalions that serve in infantry units, but there's not enough to really form any hard and fast rules.
Interesting. You can see so much American doctrine is written in reaction to what people think happened in France in 1940, solving the problem of an armoured breakout like that, of that situation. But obviously, as everyone's been figuring out how to deal with that problem. And to a certain degree, they don't really know, do they? They have a fair guess.
No, they don't. That's one of the U.S. Army's biggest problems during World War II is the whole issue of translating military intelligence into actionable stuff as far as technology, as far as tank technology or anti-tank technology. It goes back to Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War happens in 1936, and the U.S. is paying very close attention to it, or trying to, but they really don't know. I did a book some years ago about tanks in the Spanish Civil War, and I looked at U.S. Army, what they thought were the lessons of tanks in the Spanish Civil War. It was a gigantic mess. They had no idea. And as you pointed out, if you go and look at the Battle of France, they have no clue what was happening. I'll give you a specific example. One of the lessons of the U.S. Army from the Battle of France was, we have to build heavy tanks because the German success was based on heavy tanks. Now, you may ask, as anybody from the contemporary perspective will, where were the heavy tanks?
Yeah. So a smattering of Panzer IVs, and that's about it, isn't it? And you call that medium tank, wouldn't you?
Right, yeah, exactly. And it was, quite honestly, a Panzer IV is a medium tank even by U.S. definition. So there was some real problems. And, this whole controversy about why the Sherman tank didn't get a better gun, in the middle of the war in 1943-44, it largely was around that issue. There were serious misunderstandings of what the Germans were doing. So, for example, the U.S. Army did know about the Panther tank as early as the summer of 1943 because they show up at the Battle of Kursk, and there's military attaches in Moscow, and they see captured examples of the Panther tank. But U.S. military intelligence makes a singular failure of judgment. They view the Panther as just being like the Tiger, just an uncommon heavy tank. We're not going to encounter them very often, just as the U.S. Army didn't encounter the Tiger very often in either North Africa or Sicily or Italy. So there's this attitude, the Panther, who cares? Of course, it's very different in 1944 when, they get to Normandy, but that's another issue.
How fascinating. Because after all, everyone's responding to blitzkrieg and armoured warfare, but an idea of it rather than really knowing what it is. You can see why you might come up with the tank destroyer conception, but then when you feed it into the reality of battle and the reality of experience, and also there is also the gap between industry being able to keep up with the demands of warfare. So, the self-propelled anti-tank gun, that tank destroyer rather than a towed gun, there you go. There's a thing that you can make the concept prove itself. But that isn't possible until much later in the war. So there's always the lag, isn't there, between conception, what industry can deliver for you, and then actually putting it into place on the battlefield.
And you have the double problem with the United States with the time factor because of the distances involved. So it's not only, the time it takes to get those lessons back to Detroit or wherever. Then on top of that, you've got to ship the stuff 3,000 miles. So, the logistic issue becomes a major factor. That adds probably another 4 or 5 month delay on the introduction of new technology.
Extraordinary. I'll tell you what, we'll take a very quick break and then we'll come back. This is fantastic brain food, isn't it, Jim?
Oh, isn't it amazing? Yeah.
Just what we wanted. We'll see you all in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, and our very special guest, Steve Zaloga. I mean, we've defined what a tank is.
We're getting to the bottom of the tank destroyer principle.
Exactly. And actually, funnily enough, this explains something we were discussing when we were in the Bulge from one of the accounts you'd been reading, Jim, which said tank destroyers including towed anti-tank pieces. And we were thinking, well, they're just towed anti-tank pieces. How are they tank destroyers conceptually?
Well, no, he said a towed tank destroyer battalion and an anti-tank battalion. What's the difference?
Oh, in the U.S. Army, if I said a towed anti-tank battalion, that's actually not the term. The term is simply tank destroyer battalion. They don't use the term anti-tank battalion. So there's only one type.
Okay, so maybe the historian in question that wrote that line had just got that wrong. It's just 2 tank destroyer battalions.
You feel the need to clarify. This is the point, isn't it? Because in people's minds now, tank destroyers are tracked vehicles, aren't they? With a turret, the M10s, M36s, that's what people think they are. And so you might feel the need to distinguish for the reader now and say towed anti-tank weapons. I could see why it would happen, Jim.
But Steve, do you think if there's a sort of a conceptual failure of the tank destroyer battalion principle or the tank destroyer arm, what do you use instead for your anti-tank guns?
Well, let me go back and mention one little detail before I get into that, and that is there are anti-tank units in the U.S. Army, but they're not battalions. The divisional anti-tank units are called anti-tank units. So if you're in an infantry division and you have an anti-tank company. It is called an anti-tank company. Tank destroyers are those battalion-sized formations.
Right. Okay.
But getting to the issue of what you use instead of tank destroyers, you use a better tank with a better tank gun. And as I said, one of the reasons that the U.S., especially in the Bulge, is having problems with the Panther is not so much a doctrinal problem as far as how you use your tanks. It's a problem that in 1943, when, for example, the British Army is adopting the Sherman Firefly or starting to develop the Sherman Firefly, the U.S. Army is not doing that. There's a real failure in 1943 of the U.S. Army failing to show foresight into what they're going to face in the way of German tanks in the summer of 44 a year later. They don't sit back and say, maybe we ought to think about the future threat. Instead, they say in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, all these places we've seen the same threat, basically Panzer IVs with a 75 millimeter gun and a smattering of Tiger heavy tanks. So they say, okay, France, it's going to be the same thing. We don't need anything better. So we'll stick with the Sherman with the 75 millimeter gun. Now, the British Army takes a different point of view. They've been in the business longer, so they've seen the Germans go from 37 millimeter anti-tank guns to 50 millimeter to 75 millimeter. They've seen the escalation of German tank armor. So they do show foresight, and they figure out, well, okay, we're okay dealing with Panzer IVs now, but we're starting to see Tigers. We probably will face a new tank threat in France in 1944, so we want something better. So they adapt the 17-pounder gun to the Sherman. The U.S. Army doesn't do that. They adopt the 76 millimeter gun at this point in time, thinking, well, that's going to be good enough without really figuring out whether it can penetrate the armor of a future tank like the Panther. And the answer is it can't. So there's a failure of military intelligence that occurs, the linkage between military intelligence and tank technology in the summer of 43 that gives the U.S. Army in the summer 1944 inadequate tanks. There should have been a U.S. tank in the summer 1944 that had a better gun, whether it was a 90 millimeter or whether it meant going for high velocity armor piercing, so-called HVAP ammunition sooner, so you can kill Panthers with HVAP ammunition. There should have been something done. And so, of course, by the late summer, there's a big rush to do things, and the big rush includes the HVAP high-velocity ammunition. It includes the new M36 90-millimeter tank destroyer. It involves speeding up the adoption of the M26 Pershing. There's a whole number of things. So the U.S. Army has a glitch in the summer of 43 that manifests itself in the summer of 1944.
Why do you think that is? Because after all, they pick up the 6-pounder quickly enough. And the British have a very good war with the 6-pounder. The ammunition keeps a pace. You get the fin stabilized rounds, all that sort of stuff. And actually, they're discarding sabot, all this sort of stuff that's coming in that the British are getting right. Why do you think that is? Is it simply that the Americans have been fighting the Germans not as long as the British have, not dealing with armor as much, and just aren't up to speed in the thinking? What is it?
Well, it's a number of things. I'll give you an example. The reason that the U.S. adopts the 6-pounder as the 57-millimeter anti-tank gun is it was already in production in the United States for Lend-Lease. The 57 is manufactured in the United States before it's used by the U.S. Army. The British mission over in Washington says, we'd like you to manufacture the 6-pounder. They say, fine. So they start building it, and it gets picked up because in Tunisia it's evident that the 37 is inadequate. Now, if the 17-pounder had been manufactured in the United States at the same time, I'm certain that the 17-pounder would have been stuck in the Sherman. There would have been no problem with it.
Okay, so let's go back to why aren't 17-pounders being made? Because the British don't need them to make 17-pounders?
The British mission never asked the United States to manufacture 17-pounders. So
why aren't the Americans looking at this 17-pounder, which is coming in 1943, and going, actually, that's quite a piece. We should have something similar?
The reason is because in 1943, they are looking at the 17-pounder, but they're not looking at the 17-pounder as a tank gun. Because the 17-pounder doesn't get mounted in a Sherman, even in the UK, until December 1943. So for the U.S., it's too late. Even if in December 1943, the U.S. had said, hey, that's a great idea, let's put the 17-pounder in the Sherman. December of 43 is just too late.
Got it.
They had seen 17-pounders in Tunisia because the British Army had used them in Tunisia. But there wasn't this feeling, largely because of the lessons of Sicily and Italy, that it was needed. Because the U.S., when they fight in Sicily, they encountered Tigers in small numbers, and same thing in Italy, but they didn't feel that there was a need for a more powerful anti-tank gun. And once again, this is a lack of foresight.
Is that on McNair's watch, Leslie McNair's watch? The failing is him and his team.
Yes, it has far more to do with Army ground forces than it does with ordnance. The Ordnance Department, which are the people, the engineers who are developing new weapons, They had been pushing through the war for more powerful tank guns.
That's amazing. So ordnance is going, you need something with greater velocity, with a bigger shell. And the Army ground forces are going, no, we don't.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a classic example. They put a 76 millimeter in the Sherman in 1942. Hardly had the Shermans begin to appear, but ordnance was sticking a 76 millimeter gun in it. And the strange thing is that everybody took a look at it and said the barrel's too long. The early 76 millimeter was a very long barrel, sort of like what you see on a Panther. So it had very good armor penetration. Some people looked at it and said the barrel's too long, it's going to go and stick on the ground, cut the barrel down. And so the 76 millimeter gun that eventually appears in the Sherman has inferior anti-tank performance because the barrel was too long and it'll bounce into the ground. There just wasn't the feel that they needed a high-performance anti-tank gun. Once again, it had to do with looking at the present and not at the future. There was just this general failure to anticipate the threat.
But is that also because in 1943, their only experience of fighting the Germans is Tunisia before Sicily? So actually, I mean, it's easy to forget that America doesn't get into the war until December 1941. It's not actually meeting any Germans on the ground, apart from the kind of smattering that go to Dieppe, until November 1942. So, yeah, latter end of November 1942, because to start off with, they're just fighting the Vichy French. So you're almost in 1943 by that point.
Yeah, exactly. It's so late that very little can be done.
So decisions are being made in the summer of 1943 on experience that's only just happened.
Unless it's a big emergency, it takes the U.S. probably about a year to get a new weapon into service. And once again, it's this tyranny of time, even during the war. And it's because it not only takes the development time, but of course you have to prepare the new ammunition, you got to train people, you got to get the maintenance people up to speed. And then it takes time to ship it. You've got the intercontinental distances that are involved. Now, there are cases where things get very, very high priority and it gets done quickly. So, for example, in the case of the M36, there is an urgent requirement put forward by the U.S. tank people in London who say they want the M36, they want the M12 self-propelled guns, and they want the M4A3E2s, the assault tank, the Sherman that has all that extra armor on it. They talk about that in the late autumn of 1943. And they get that stuff sort of the middle to later part of the summer of 1944. So they get it in roughly 9 months. And those are sort of emergency bases. The real emergency basis one, the fastest example, was the DD tank for Normandy. That requirement doesn't emerge until about November, December 1943. And basically, Devers, who headed the ETO USA at the time, he got in direct touch with Marshall and said, this is urgent. For Operation Neptune, we need these DD tanks to land in the assault waves. And so they give it a AAA priority. And so they start literally in January, and they deliver the first DD tanks in March. 3 months later, and the first ones appear in England in April. So it only took 4 months, roughly, from the start of the program to tanks turning up in the UK. But that was AAA rating. That was the equivalent of the A-bomb. And so most tank programs don't get AAA rating, but the DD tank did. So
Is this as much to do with, because of these great long supply chains, that McNair's thinking, I just want to keep things simple. If I'm reintroducing new ammunition in a new weapon, that we're going to have to start retrain people all over again. You see that often enough in the British Army, where they think, well, we've got people trained to a standard on this, changing things. Jim, we've talked about this off Montgomery's attitude to tactical doctrine. His view is, I've got a system now. It's worked out and it fits the limitations of the people I'm being provided with by the army. If I have to change anything, we're just starting again. And will it work? And whereas this works within the tolerances that I'm prepared to run an army on, and I've got other things to worry about as well. Is it as much that, do you think?
But it also goes down to numbers again, doesn't it? That point that Steve was making right at the beginning. Numbers mean a huge amount. Most prevalent German tank of the war, if I remember rightly, was the Panzer IV, and I think they only make about 8,000 of them. They make about 6,000 Panthers. They only make 1,347 Tigers and 492 King Tigers in total, compared with 49,000 Shermans and 74,000 Sherman hulls. Or 84,500 T-34s. I mean, numbers, it has a value all of its own, doesn't it? And also, the other thing is numbers also means you've got parts. You can cross those apart, and a tank can be on a battlefield. You can whisk it off again because it's got damage, and you can take one that's been knocked out, but it might have the tracks you need for the one that's just lost a track. when you've got those kind of numbers, that just gives you such an advantage and an ability to maintain these beasts in the field, which of course is so important. And that's the sort of the Achilles heel of the highly specialized short production form tank, like a King Tiger or a Tiger or a Panther, where you haven't really got the numbers. They're incredibly complex. If anything goes wrong in the battlefield, you've got a massive headache on your hands.
You have to also realize, and I'm sure you do, that the U.S. Army that goes into France in 1944 is largely a green and inexperienced army.
Yeah, of course. It's such a good point.
Except for 1st Infantry Division, there's hardly anybody who's that experienced. And if you take a look at the tank units, there's really only 2 tank units that had any experience. The 70th Tank Battalion, which is just a tiny little tank battalion, they had landed in North Africa, and then they fight in Sicily.
Weren't they even on Stuarts, if I remember rightly, the 70th?
Yeah, it was a light tank battalion down in the Med.
In that time, since Sicily, they've also switched from Stuarts to Sherman, so they've got a new tank as well.
Yeah, and they land on Utah Beach. And then the other tank unit is 2nd Armored Division. And 2nd Armored Division landed in North Africa, but didn't really fight that much. And then, of course, they land again in Sicily. So 2nd Armored Division is the only of the 13 armor divisions that serve in France in 1944-45. They're the only ones who had any experience at all before they got up to France.
Isn't that amazing? I've just not stopped to consider that.
So when they're talking Sherman tanks, everybody's been trained on Sherman tanks and everybody's been trained. Well, I'll give you the other direct example. In April of 1944, Ordnance delivers 120 Shermans with 76 millimeter guns to the UK. This new version of the Sherman tank with a new, more powerful tank gun. So they go to all the tank battalions that are training over in the UK, and they say, okay, you guys, who wants this brand new tank with this powerful new anti-tank gun? And everybody raised their hand and said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. There's 2 reasons for it. Number 1 reason is we've just finished training all these guys. We don't want a new thing that we're going to have to train everybody on, and we don't want another logistics train where we're going to have 2 different kind of ammunitions. And then the other point, which is oftentimes not realized, they didn't like the 76 millimeter gun because when you go for high performance anti-armor weapons, they have high velocity projectiles. High velocity projectiles can't carry a lot of high explosive, whether it's a Panther or a Firefly.
Yeah. And you need HE, don't you?
You need HE. And the guys in the tank battalions and the armor divisions, they wanted the 75 millimeter guns and the Shermans because they fired a high explosive round that had almost twice as much high explosive as the 76 millimeter. 76 millimeter was great for shooting at armor targets, but it was lousy for shooting at the target you usually shoot at, which is, troops and trucks and buildings and stuff like that.
There's hardly any tank-on-tank actions, are there? I mean, comparatively.
And the British are in the same tangle with a 6-pounder in Churchill's as well, because it can't fire a decent enough HE round. Everyone's got this problem.
And you go back to John Semkin in his 75 Sherman, turning around the corner, facing off a Tiger tank at 300 yards and beating it. And the reason he beats it is because he can fire 10 75 millimeter rounds before a Tiger can fire off 1. He doesn't destroy the tank, but he makes the crew bail out and surrender. You don't need to destroy it.
It gets proved in the U.S. case because the first time the U.S. faces a large tank-on-tank battle, the U.S. really has no large tank-on-tank battles in Normandy. There's certainly encounters with German tanks, but there's no big battles, not like what the British face around Caen. So the first one occurs in Lorraine with Patton's Third Army in September when the Germans launched that local Lorraine panzer counteroffensive.
Yep.
And so 4th Armored Division faces a number of German panzer brigades, and they absolutely trounced them. The panzer brigades had brand new Panthers, and 4th Armored didn't have the new 76 millimeters or hardly any of the new 76 millimeters. They had all the old Shermans with the 75s. They had no problems dominating the Germans, and the reason had to do with experience. The 4th Armored Division was, first of all, very well led by John Wood.
Yep.
Number 2, very well trained. It had been in business since 1942. So the crews were experienced, and they had gotten enough experience without suffering heavy losses in France. They were with Third Army, so they went racing down into Brittany. They did not take heavy losses down in Brittany. Then they took part in the great race, across past the Seine River. So they got a lot of experience in operating tanks day to day without suffering very heavy casualties. So they show up in Lorraine, very well experienced. They know how to operate, very well trained in things like tank gunnery. They didn't suffer a lot of crew losses, so they knew not only how to use the tank gun, but they knew how to use the Sherman stabilizer, which is hard to use for inexperienced crews, but 4th had very good crews. And so they knew how to use the tank stabilizer so they could, if not fire on the move, at least keep the gun pointed while they were moving. And the Germans were exactly the opposite. The Panzer Brigades are this new formation that Hitler had formed in the summer of 44. It's a very slapdash organization. The crews don't have very much training. They weren't together very long. And so you run up into a situation where you have one side, the U.S. Army side, which doesn't have the better equipment, but has the better training. And then on the other side, you have the team that has the better equipment, but they're poorly trained and poorly led. And tactics and training have a lot more to do with victory in tank fighting than the technology does.
Yeah, that's such a great line. And that's so true. And that's why Semkin wins against that Tiger.
But that encounters 200 German vehicles lost for the sort of 41. It's that proportion of defeat that the Germans endure, isn't it?
Yeah, the brigades that were involved in Lorraine are basically shattered in the sense that they're completely combat ineffective. I mean, it's nowhere near close as far as the exchange ratio.
No.
But, it's one of the problems that, countries face now, isn't it? I mean, Britain has these incredibly complicated armored fighting vehicles and tanks and doesn't have very many of them because they're incredibly expensive to make, they're incredibly complex, and, they just can't afford them. And if anything happens to them, they're gone. Whereas you can have a lesser tank with greater numbers that can do the job that you want it to do for the most part, just as effectively.
Yes, but I mean, part of that's a function of the fact that the vehicles we have now are peacetime purchases, aren't they? So they've got to last. Whereas what's the life expectancy of an M4? When that rolls off the production line, how long in battle might that last? I mean, a day even. I mean, this is the thing. Whereas they're not being designed to last forever like a Challenger 3 conception. Some of those chassis are going to be very, very old because they're peacetime vehicles.
The last U.S. Abrams tank, M1 Abrams tank that was built was roughly 1990. So that was roughly 35 years ago. What the U.S. has been doing since then has simply been rebuilding the same hulls. They have a facility down in Anniston. They go and take the tank apart. They strip it down to the basic armor hull, basic armor turret, and then rebuild it. And so, you see the U.S. is selling brand new Abrams tanks to Poland or to whoever, to Egypt or to Saudi Arabia. Well, not really. The original core of that tank was probably built in the 1980s. It's been completely rebuilt for all intents and purposes as a new tank. The expendable parts are all brand new. And the same thing with the Challengers. Most of the Challengers are rebuilds. The Leopards are the same way. There are some new build Leopards, in Germany, but a lot of those things are rebuilds also. They're just, they're built as Leopard 2A0s and now they're Leopard 2A7s or, that sort of thing. And they may have been rebuilt multiple times.
George Washington's axe, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Is the tank, I mean, we succeeded in defining a tank, and we've gone through many of the trials and tribulations of the tank in the Second World War. A thing that's in the air at the moment is the idea that the age of the tank is over, that now that with weapons like Javelin and drones and things, that essentially you're really a great big moving target, aren't you? And that it's over. I mean, we're going off piece a little here, Steve, but what do you think?
Well, the age of the tank has been over since 1917. It's always been over.
That's the perfect answer, isn't it?
There's a great article in one of the U.S. Army journals from, I think, 1937 saying the Spanish Civil War has proven that the anti-tank gun will sweep the tank off the battlefield the same way that the machine gun swept the cavalry off the battlefield in 1914. And obviously that didn't happen in World War II. And, in 1973 with the Mideast War, the guided anti-tank missile is going to sweep the tank off the battlefield. And somehow that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And now the FPV drone is going to sweep the tank off the battlefield. I actually have to write about drones, and I actually finished doing our company's report on loitering munitions and FPV drones just yesterday. And all I can say is, yeah, it's an interesting new technology, but it's much like the guided anti-tank missile of 1973 or the towed anti-tank gun of 1937. Yeah, it's a new ingredient on the battlefield, but what do you replace the tank with? The tank provides all of these things that you need. It provides protection. It provides firepower. It provides mobility. If you don't have a tank, you're going to have some other sort of vehicle that maybe you don't call a tank. But, I mean, the infantry has been vulnerable since men have been fighting in war. And that doesn't mean the war stops because, men are so easy to kill. It's the same thing with tanks. Tanks provide these features that are essential on the modern battlefield. And if you don't have something called a tank, you're going to have some other type of vehicle, some kind of mobile firepower to perform those functions. I can't imagine that warfare is going to go back entirely to foot infantry and, remotely piloted vehicles and that sort of thing. You're still going to need some form of protection. You're going to need some form of mobility. You're going to need some form of heavy firepower up front there. So I think the solution to the FPV threat, these kamikaze drones, is probably going to be more technology, not the demise of the tank.
Yeah.
I mean, right now it's very crude stuff. It's the cope cages and all that other stuff that they're lashing to the tanks. But armies have been working on active protection systems now for 3 or 4 decades. They're starting to show up. The Israeli trophy system is starting to show up on various people's tanks. The strange thing about active protection systems, though, is that both the Ukrainians and Russians had active protection systems at the beginning of the war in 2023. They do not appear to have been used on the battlefield. It may have to do with cost. Active protection systems are expensive. They cost $1 million or more per tank. So it may just be with all the other expenses that these armies are fighting, they just can't afford to put active protection systems on their tanks. But I think that's the direction we're leaning in more. That is technology to deal with other types of new technology.
It's electric countermeasures as much as anything else, isn't it? Electronic countermeasures.
Yeah, the Ukrainians last month said that they were losing something like 10,000 attack drones every month to electronic jamming.
Wow.
So the FPVs are getting through, but getting through in smaller and smaller numbers. But, a part of our problem with looking at Ukraine is the same problem that the U.S. Army faced when looking at Spain in 1937.
Right.
The information that's coming out is very incomplete. We don't really know, or those of us in the public. There's people down in the Pentagon, there's people in Kiev, and there's people elsewhere in Moscow who know the real answers because they're getting the operations reports back from the front. So they know how many FPV kamikaze drones are successful. We don't really know. We're just getting press reports, and the press reports are lousy. I mean, I hate to say it now, but media these days is terrible. I've dealt with media for 30, 40 years. I was in the media for a number of years. The media now, they just don't have specialists in defense affairs. And the coverage of military affairs these days is far worse than it was, say, 30 years ago. I can remember dealing with the defense press 30 years ago. It tended to be much better informed on defense issues. These days, it's not, sad to say.
Steve, we should let you go. But one last question is that we've been preparing a big series on the Battle of the Bulge for the podcast, and it's coming up. But boy, there's a hell of a lot of tracked vehicles in there, aren't there, for winter?
Oh, all sorts of stuff, because it's not only the tanks. That's a battle also that involves large numbers of half tracks on both sides. So you have the Panzer Grenadiers on the German side using half tracks. You have the U.S. Armored Infantry, because the U.S. pumps in a lot of armor divisions. So when they pump in the armor divisions, they're not only pumping in tanks, they're also pumping in armored half tracks. And if you take a U.S. Armored Division, they have 3 battalions of tanks, 3 battalions of armored infantry, but they also have 3 battalions of field artillery. And people don't give it enough credit, but the decisive arm for the U.S. Army in the Ardennes is not tanks, it's field artillery.
Right.
The towed stuff and the SP stuff. So when you bring out that armored field artillery, you bring a real new ingredient to the battlefield because it's very mobile, a lot of firepower, and then you combine it with very advanced fire control and very, very lethal. And people just ignore that. It's partly because people like playing video games and stuff. A lot of the enthusiasts play video games or they play traditional board games, and it's hard to replicate artillery.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody who was there on the battlefield, I'm sure would have said, the dominant arm is the field artillery. But from the perspective of a lot of us who started out in this business, being enthusiasts and playing war games and stuff like that, field artillery is just very hard to mimic in those venues. And so we don't appreciate it.
And field artillery, and a lot of it is tracked in the Ardennes.
Yes. On the U.S. side, it is. Well, anything that's associated with an armored division is tracked. Any of the field artillery battalions with an armored division are tracked.
Is that how it works? So if you're just field artillery attached to an infantry division, then you're towed. And if you're in an armored division, then you're tracked. You're a priest or whatever.
Yeah, it's an M7 priest. The sole exception is there's a handful of priest battalions that are separate. They're under essentially GHQ control. They're under Field Army control or Corps control, but they're relatively small in number. They don't really amount to much. So most of the self-propelled stuff is with the armored divisions.
And you have the proximity fuse as well to sort of round all that off. So
yes,
what the Americans are doing in terms of the tubes, particularly, when we looked at the northern sector of the Bulge battle, the fires that are happening in the Krinkelterwald and round there are absolutely emphatic battle-winning intervention by field artillery, isn't it? I mean, it's, 10,000 rounds a day. It's that sort of stuff. Every tube available.
It's phenomenal. When
they put the hammer down, in that respect, it's really something, isn't it?
Well, the artillery crushes 1st SS Panzer Corps. Everybody hears about Kampfgruppe Piper and 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Both of those divisions are crushed by field artillery. I mean, the infantry holds them in place. If you don't have the infantry there to hold them, they're going to get through and start the exploitation.
So we shouldn't be dissing kind of McKinley.
No. It's combined arms. I mean, 1944-45 combat is combined arms. You absolutely must have the infantry, because if you don't have the infantry to stop the panzer attack, your artillery can't do its job. You've got to hold them in place.
One of my observations from the Ardennes battle is that everyone's talked a huge amount about the tactical flexibility of the Germans and their ability to kind of whisk things into battle groups very quickly. What is amazing to me about the Battle of the Bulge is how quickly divisions which are going in one direction turn 90 degrees and head off in another direction in really, really quick order. And it's incredibly a complicated thing because you've got to work out your march orders and your routes you're going to take. And these are roads which aren't simply not designed for that kind of weight of traffic. It's absolutely phenomenal. And the speed of which they organize themselves into task forces, which is, I guess, the same as a battle group in many ways, and hold a crossroads or whatever it might be, whether it be at Manhay or wherever, or Parker's Crossroads, for example. It's incredible. And no one seems to be giving the Americans the credit for that, I don't think. I mean, I think people are still so obsessed with German tactical flexibility that they ignore actually what's happening in the US Army in the latter stages of the war.
The thing there is that was baked into the US armored divisions almost from the outset, because in 1942, and they did the first March of 42, and they did the first reorganization of the armored divisions, they created those 2 combat command headquarters. And those are designed specifically for that mission. They're designed to create independent combined arms formations that are a mixture of forces. What do you need? Do you need more infantry? Is it a defensive battle? Do you need more armored infantry? Or is it offensive and you need more speed and mobility? Do you need more tanks? And so it gets refined in 1943 with the third reorganization, the September 43 reorganization, which adds a third combat command. So by the summer of 44, the winter of 44-45, the armored divisions have 3 combat commands. And from the summer of 44, the combat commands learn how to create task forces, which are battalion-sized formations under the combat command.
When's that from the summer of 43?
There are task forces organized in 43. For example, on Sicily, there are task forces.
But mainly it's 44 that they're doing this.
But mainly on 44, and it's simply because it's not institutionalized, I would say, until the summer of 44. But by the summer of 44, it becomes commonplace. You look at practically any engagement in 1944, and the use of the task forces, which is a formation under the combat command, they become commonplace. I mean, almost day to day. And that is, once again, stressing the evolution of combined arm tactics versus the earlier blitzkrieg tactics. I mean, combined arms is, the integration of the various combat arms, and it helps to have a headquarters element, namely the combat command, that's set up right from the beginning to do that. The German Kampfgruppe is typically, you use the headquarters of whatever unit is leading the Kampfgruppe. So if you've got a Panzer regiment, it's going to be the Panzer regiment headquarters. But in the case of the U.S. unit, it's not the battalion headquarters. It's a separate headquarters that exists underneath the division that has no other function but to create those combined arms task forces. So, that's all that those people are there for.
That is clever, isn't it?
And it means they've got the radios. That's the other thing that everybody forgets in all this combined arms stuff. You have to have the radios. And so these combat commands have a radio set up which enables them to deal remotely with all of their elements. So if you've got a couple battalions 30 miles down the road from you, it's no big deal to get on the radio and say, I need you to start moving. That's the other forgotten element of World War II technology. I mean, radio is a big thing. You didn't have radio back in World War I to the same extent.
So Steve, I mean, you've written huge numbers of books. If people want to find out more about this stuff, which ones would you direct them to?
It depends if they want to see hardware or campaign stuff. Most of the books I do are for Osprey, and people will be familiar with the Osprey publications.
Of course.
I do a lot for the new Vanguard series, which are hardware books. I do a lot of books for the campaign series, so I've done a couple on the Battle of the Bulge. I've also done some books for other publishers like Stackpole. I've done a Battle of the Bulge book there, which deals with the defeat of the 12th SS Panzer Division. If people just want to read something about, it's the best tank of World War II. I did a book specifically about that called Armour Champion.
Yes.
That deals only with that issue.
And if they want to read about development of combined arms in the U.S. Army?
Strangely enough, the book I'm working on right now, which I don't know if I'm supposed to say, but it's an Osprey book. I'm doing a thing on U.S. tank tactics in World War II.
Amazing. There we go.
But it's going to be a very short little book. It's in their Elite series. They've already got books in that series dealing with armored infantry. This is just kind of a part of a little set that they have. Osprey did a series called Battle Order some years ago. They've got kind of an orange cover on them, and I did 3 for them. One on U.S. armor units down in North Africa and Italy, one on armor divisions in the European theater, and one on tank destroyer and tank battalions in the ETO. And that's a mixture of, what are the issues of organization, what are the issues of tactics, and it gives a lot of examples of tanks and their tactical use in battle. So if they don't want to wait for this other thing, if they see that Battle Order series, that covers a lot of this ground.
Brilliant.
Well, Steve, it's been absolutely fantastic having you. What an absolutely amazing mine of information you are.
What a treat.
What a treat. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, please come on again. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I always like talking about tanks.
Well, so do we, weirdly, so everyone's happy.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. You've been listening to me, James Holland, and Steve Zaloga talking about tanks. Or we have ways of making you talk. Thanks again, everybody, for lending us your ears. Cheerio.
Cheerio.